Humans declared Terran borders off-limits. The galaxy defied them and paid the price. The alarm did not build slowly. It hit all at once. 7 Terran colony ships were drifting in the Helios 4 mining corridor, their engines completely cold, their crews sealed inside with no way to call for help. The ships had not been destroyed. They had been emptied. Every person on board had been taken, and not a single distress beacon had fired before the silence settled in. When the rescue vessel piloted by Commander Liam Garrett arrived on scene, he stood at the viewport for a long time without saying a word. He had seen accidents before. He had seen equipment failures and pressure seal collapses, and all the brutal things deep space could do to human beings. But this was not any of those things. This was deliberate. This was a message. The message was not new. For nearly 40 years, since humanity had first pushed past the orbit of Neptune and begun setting up permanent outposts in the outer corridors, the other species of the galaxy had made their position perfectly clear. Humans were tolerated. They were not respected. They were considered a young, unrefined civilization that had stumbled into galactic space before they were ready, and the older species saw no reason to pretend otherwise. The Kreth Dominion had been the loudest about it. Their council representatives had said in open sessions of the Galactic Conclave that humans were, in their precise words, a transitional species, meaning they expected humanity to either fall in line or fall apart before long. The Uli merchant fleets had been quieter, but no less dismissive. They had rerouted their trade lanes through human-adjacent corridors without asking permission, treating Terran space like an open road that belonged to everyone and no one at the same time. Their representatives had attended conclave sessions for decades and had never once addressed a human diplomat by name during a formal session. They used phrases like the Terran Party and the Sol representatives as if they were describing a weather event rather than a civilization with 1 billion people spread across 14 colony zones. When Terran diplomats raised this habit in informal settings, Uli representatives would express genuine puzzlement and say that they had meant no disrespect, that the phrasing was simply customary. The Terran diplomats would note the response and say nothing more, and add it to the file. The file was very thick by now. The Oresi Collective had simply never acknowledged the problem at all. When a human diplomat named Oliver Payne raised the issue of unauthorized passage through the Kepler-22 buffer zone in a formal conclave session in 2251, the Oresi representative had looked at him the way someone looks at a child who has spoken out of turn at an adult table. There had been polite murmuring and a motion to table the discussion, and that had been the end of it. Oliver Payne had returned home and written a report that sat in a secure government file for 11 years before anyone read it properly. When they finally did, it was because things had gotten considerably worse. The disappearances had started small. A survey team here, a maintenance crew there, individual miners who were there one shift and gone the next, their personal locators offline, their vessels undisturbed, their coffee still warm in the cups on the table. The Terran Governing Council had investigated every single case and had arrived at the same uncomfortable conclusion each time. None of these people had left their posts voluntarily. None of the equipment failures had been accidental. Someone was taking humans, and whoever it was had enough technology to do it without leaving a trace that Terran forensic teams could identify. The Council had filed formal complaints with the Galactic Conclave on 47 separate occasions over the span of a decade. They received responses on 6 of those occasions. Of those 6 responses, 3 were written in a language that had not been officially translated into Terran Standard, and 1 was simply a notice that the filing had been received and logged. The other 2 were politely worded suggestions that humanity improve its border monitoring systems, as if the fault lay with the humans for not watching their own people closely enough. The tone of those 2 responses was almost parentally condescending, and the Council's legal team had spent an afternoon debating whether to formally object to the tone before deciding that objecting to tone in a document that had itself gone unanswered would produce nothing useful. What the galaxy did not understand, and what it would pay dearly for not understanding, was that the humans filing those complaints were not naive. They were not hoping that words alone would solve the problem. They were building a record. Every unanswered message, every ignored complaint, every unauthorized transit, logged and filed and dated and preserved. They were building it the way a careful person builds anything important, one layer at a time, without announcing what they were doing, until the structure was complete enough to bear real weight. Secretary General Amara Osei had been in her third year of office when the Helios 4 incident happened. She was not a person who showed panic. Everyone who had ever worked with her described her the same way: steady, measured. Someone who listened completely before she spoke, and when she spoke, said exactly what she meant and nothing she did not mean. She had been a deep space negotiator before moving into government, and she had sat across the table from representatives of 11 different species over 17 years. She understood, better than most, that the galaxy did not respect weakness. She also understood something that many of her colleagues had not yet fully grasped. The galaxy had mistaken human patience for human limitation, and those were two very different things. Patience was a choice. Limitation was a condition. The first could end without warning. The second could not. She called a closed session of the Terran Governing Council, within 6 hours of receiving Liam Garrett's preliminary report from the Helios 4 corridor. The session lasted 19 hours. No one left the room except twice for water. By the time the doors opened again, a decision had been made that would change the structure of galactic politics permanently. Not a short-term policy shift, a structural change. The kind of decision that looks simple from a distance and only reveals its full weight when you try to reverse it and discover that reversing it would require undoing everything built around it. It was not a decision made in anger, and that was perhaps the most important thing about it. It was calm, deliberate, and backed by years of legal documentation, recorded violations, and unanswered complaints that together formed an undeniable record. The Council agreed unanimously on two things. First, that every single violation, disappearance, unauthorized transit, and ignored complaint would be compiled into a formal historical record and transmitted to every member species of the Galactic Conclave simultaneously. Second, that effective immediately, the Sol System and 14 designated outer colony zones would be declared off-limits to all non-Terran vessels without explicit prior authorization. Not restricted, not discouraged, off-limits. The Council's legal team, led by a precise and methodical attorney named Gregory Cole, had spent the previous 8 months preparing for exactly this moment. Every piece of the declaration had been written in full compliance with galactic common law. Every coordinate had been formally registered. Every legal justification had been drafted and cross-referenced against existing conclave precedents going back 90 years. When Amara Osei reviewed the final document, she read it twice and made 3 minor edits to the language, precise edits that tightened 2 ambiguous clauses and corrected 1 date reference. Then she approved it. The broadcast went out across the galactic comnet in 47 languages on the 14th of March, 2287. It was not a long transmission. It did not include threats or emotional language. It stated the boundary coordinates, listed the dates of establishment, referenced the legal framework under galactic common law that permitted sovereign species to declare exclusion zones, and ended with 3 words that were identical in every language it was transmitted in. Do not enter. In the ornate hall of the Grand Conclave on the Aresi homeworld, several representatives laughed openly when the transmission was read aloud. The Kreth delegate, a senior official named Vreth Kaldon who had spent 30 years treating human diplomats with barely concealed contempt, reportedly smiled and said something to the representative beside him that was not translated for the record. He was not worried. The Uli Trading Consortium sent a private message to the Terran Council the same afternoon asking, with polished diplomatic language, whether the declaration was intended to be taken literally or whether it was an opening position in a new round of negotiations. The Council responded within the hour. The declaration was not a negotiating position. It was a fact. No one in the galaxy believed them. That was the first mistake. What the older species did not know, and what they had never bothered to find out, was what humanity had been doing for the past 11 years since the complaints began going unanswered. They had assumed humans were frustrated and helpless, filing documents into the void and hoping for a change that would never come. They had not considered that humans might be building something alongside those documents. They had not considered that a species willing to spend 11 years logging every violation with precise timestamps and cross-referenced evidence might also be spending those same 11 years preparing for the moment when the logging was finished and the next phase could begin. Commander Liam Garrett returned to his vessel after submitting his full report on the Helios 4 scene. He sat in the pilot's chair for a long time, looking at the stars through the forward glass. He had a daughter named Clara, who was 9 years old and had never known a galaxy that treated her species as anything other than a nuisance to be managed. He had taken this assignment, and the many difficult assignments before it, because he believed the situation would not always be this way. Not because he had faith in the goodness of other civilizations, but because he understood that every unjust system eventually produces its own consequence. He filed his next assignment request and went to sleep. Far across the galaxy, in meeting rooms and council chambers and aboard trading vessels, the representatives of the most powerful civilizations in the known universe continued to laugh. Some of them were already planning to test the boundary. They were making those plans with the comfortable confidence of people who had never once been proven wrong about humans. That comfort would not last long. It would last exactly 3 weeks. The report Oliver Payne had written sat unread for 11 years, not because it was unimportant, but because importance alone had never been a sufficient reason for the Conclave to act on a complaint filed by a species it did not yet take seriously. The report was precise. It documented 6 separate transit events in the Kepler-22 zone over a period of 14 months, each one a ULI commercial vessel passing through a corridor that fell within the buffer zone boundaries that humanity had registered, but that the ULI fleet coordinator had apparently never consulted, or had consulted and dismissed. The report included sensor captures, timestamps, and a legal analysis demonstrating that each transit constituted a formal violation of the buffer zone protocols under the same galactic common law that the Conclave publicly claimed to uphold. None of it was ambiguous. None of it was exaggerated. It was exactly the kind of documentation that should have produced a response, and the absence of any response was, in its own way, as informative as any answer could have been. Oliver Payne had returned home understanding something that would take the rest of the diplomatic corps another decade to fully internalize. The Conclave did not fail to respond to his complaint, because the complaint was unclear. It failed to respond because it did not believe a response was necessary. And it did not believe a response was necessary, because it did not believe humanity was capable of making a non-response costly. The humans filing complaints were not the kind of people who forgot what had been filed. They were the kind of people who kept the copies. 3 weeks after the Terran declaration reached every corner of the galactic comnet, a Kreth survey fleet crossed into the Proxima Centauri buffer zone at 0314 station time. The fleet consisted of 7 vessels. They were not small ships. The lead vessel alone was 4 times the size of the largest Terran warship that the Kreth had ever observed in action, and the fleet commander, High Admiral Vreth Kaldon, had personally chosen to lead the transit himself. He had done so because he believed it would be instructive, and because he believed that a personal demonstration, documented and reported back to the Grand Conclave, would settle the question of human enforcement capacity once and for all, and allow the Conclave to move forward from the awkward position the Terran declaration had created. He was inside the buffer zone for 11 minutes. In those 11 minutes, Vreth Kaldon experienced something that no one in his long career had ever made him feel. Genuine surprise. Not the mild surprise of an unexpected development that could be quickly categorized and managed. The kind of surprise that takes several seconds to fully register, because the brain is still applying the old framework to a situation that has completely departed from it, and the framework keeps failing, and the brain keeps trying it again because there is not yet a new one ready to replace it. There was no hail. There was no warning shot. There was no transmission asking him to identify himself or state his purpose. The Terran response did not begin with any of the diplomatic formalities that every species in the galaxy used when they wanted to project strength while still leaving room for discussion. The Terran response began without a single word. 42 vessels materialized on his sensor grid simultaneously. They had been running silent, no active emissions, no navigation lights, no thermal signatures above the ambient background of deep space, positioned in a precise geometric formation that had clearly been calculated in advance for exactly this corridor, at exactly this approach angle. They had not scrambled to intercept him. They had not been summoned by any alert he had triggered. They had been there already, invisible to his sensors until the moment they chose to be seen. His sensor officer, a calm professional named Desh who had served with distinction for 15 years and had never raised her voice in an operational environment, raised her voice for the first time in her career. She said the word impossible, and then she said it again, and then she started reading numbers aloud that did not match anything in Kreth tactical doctrine. The Terran fleet was holding a distributed formation pattern that made it extremely difficult to target multiple vessels simultaneously without significant exposure. They were not moving toward his fleet. They were not moving at all. They were simply present, surrounding the Kreth convoy on 4 axes, completely enclosing the approach corridor in a configuration that had no gaps large enough for his vessels to navigate through without entering what his tactical system was already calculating as an extremely unfavorable engagement range. Vreth Kaldan had just enough time to fully process this before the systems on his lead vessel began to fail. Not fail catastrophically, not explode or collapse in any way that would have made immediate tactical sense. They simply stopped responding. The propulsion controls locked mid-cycle. The communications array went dark without error codes. The weapons targeting system, which his crew had activated the moment the Terran fleet appeared on sensors, stopped accepting commands as cleanly as if someone had removed the relevant circuit from the hardware. The process took approximately 90 seconds from first contact to complete system lockdown across the lead vessel, and his engineering team, working at full emergency speed, reported within minutes that they could find no physical damage anywhere on the ship, no hull stress, no overload indicators, no component failure flags. The systems were intact. They were simply not operating. He found out later that the same process had happened to all 7 of his vessels, within a window of 4 minutes. The timing across the fleet was almost perfectly uniform, which told him something he did not want to know. It was not a brute force energy attack that had happened to catch them all. It was something that had been developed specifically for his fleet configuration, calibrated to his vessel's systems, which meant they had known he was coming, known exactly what he was bringing, and had time to prepare a precise and targeted response before he ever crossed the boundary. The implication of that was not comfortable. Intelligence of that quality did not come from guessing. What happened next was, in some ways, even more uncomfortable than the technical lockdown. The Terran fleet dispatched a single small vessel to each of the 7 Kreth ships, not armed boarding parties and tactical equipment, not hazard teams, small transport craft, each carrying a crew of 4 humans in standard duty uniforms, with no visible armament of any kind. These crews boarded the Kreth vessels through external docking links with the confidence of people who had done this before in training, and were now simply doing it in the field, walked to the command decks without escort, confirmed in person that all systems were locked and all crew members were unharmed, and departed. They took nothing. They touched nothing beyond what was directly necessary to move through the ship. They conducted themselves with the quiet efficiency of people performing a scheduled task that they had practiced and were now completing on schedule. Not a word was spoken aloud by any member of either crew during the entire process on any of the 7 vessels. They left behind, on each command console, a single data chip. When Kreth technicians later managed to interface with those chips after the lockdown was lifted, they found the complete, unedited record of every unauthorized Kreth incursion into Terran space over the previous 31 years. Every transit, every mining claim filed in Terran-adjacent zones without notification, every communication from the Terran Governing Council that had gone unanswered. The record was precise to the hour and minute. It had been compiled over years, maintained without gaps, and was entirely and verifiably accurate. Not a single entry in it could be disputed, because every entry was backed by sensor data, communication logs, and independent verification from third-party monitoring systems that the Kreth had not known were present. Attached to the end of this record was a single line of text. The warning was the courtesy. There will not be another. The 7 ships were released from the system lockdown within 6 hours. Tractor fields from the Terran fleet guided each vessel back across the buffer zone boundary with complete control, then released them on the correct side. The entire event, from the moment Vreth Kaldan crossed into the zone to the moment his 7th vessel was returned to unclaimed space, had taken 14 hours and 22 minutes. No crew member on any Kreth vessel had been harmed. No vessel had been structurally damaged. By any technical definition, nothing had been destroyed, and nothing had been taken. And yet Vreth Kaldan sat in his command chair for a long time after the Terran fleet disappeared from his sensors, and he did not speak. His communications officer, a young man named Pelth on his first major deep space assignment, asked with careful respect whether they should report to the Kreth High Command immediately. Vreth Kaldon said yes. He gave the order. He sat quietly for several more minutes, looking at the space where 42 Terran vessels had been moments before, a space that was now completely empty and undisturbed, as if nothing had ever been there. Then he said one more thing, quietly, to no one in particular. He said they should have read the documentation more carefully. Pelth logged the statement in his duty journal. He would cite it in a memoir written decades later, as the first moment he understood that this confrontation was not going to resolve the way anyone outside Earth had assumed it would. The footage from the encounter was supposed to be classified. It was not classified for long. A ULI commercial monitoring buoy, quietly positioned in the outer corridor near the buffer zone for standard commercial observation, had captured the event on passive sensors from a distance of approximately 12,000 kilometers. Within 48 hours, full recordings had been transmitted to 14 different news and intelligence services across the galaxy. Every major species had the footage within 3 days. The galaxy watched it in silence. Not the silence of shock exactly. The silence of people reassessing something they had believed completely, and finding the ground shifting beneath the belief, in a way that could not be stopped by arguing with it. Back on Earth, Secretary General Amara Osei received the news from Helen Brooke, who placed a summary report on the table, without theatrical emphasis, and said the first test of the boundary had been resolved in accordance with the prepared response plan. Every parameter had been met. Amara Osei read the report. She set it down. She asked 2 questions. Whether any Terran personnel had been injured. No. Whether any Terran vessel had been identified by name or registry to the opposing command. No. The entire operation had been conducted without activating a single public identification beacon. She said that was exactly right, and asked for the next item on the agenda. The people in that room had worked with her long enough to understand that steadiness. It did not mean she was unaffected. It meant she had already calculated what came next. And what came next required exactly the same discipline that had brought them to this point. Because the Proxima Centauri incident was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of a confrontation considerably larger than one 7-ship fleet in one buffer zone, and that confrontation had already been set in motion before the dust from the first one fully settled. The Oresi Collective's response to the Proxima footage was slower and more careful than the Kreth's reaction, and slower still than the public reaction of the smaller species who simply watched the recordings and stopped making jokes about human enforcement capacity. The Oresi were not a species given to rapid public statements on matters they had not fully analyzed, and the analysis of the Proxima footage took them 11 days. What emerged from those 11 days was not the single conclusion that most observers expected. It was a set of questions that the Oresi intelligence leadership considered more worrying than the footage itself. The questions centered on what the footage did not show. The Terran fleet had been in position before the Kreth arrived. That was visible in the sensor data. What was not visible, what could not be reconstructed from the footage alone, was when they had arrived. The Kreth survey fleet had been under communication observation protocols from the moment Vreth Kaldon filed his transit plan with the Kreth High Command. If the Terran fleet had known the transit was coming, they had known it through intelligence acquisition. If they had intelligence acquisition capability sophisticated enough to intercept Kreth High Command communications before Vreth Kaldon crossed the boundary, then the 42 vessels waiting in the corridor were not the totality of what humanity had built during the years of unanswered complaints. They were the visible part of something considerably larger. A senior analyst named Fail, who had spent the past 3 years compiling the Oresi Collective's assessment of Terran military development and had consistently rated that capability as moderate and growing, revised his assessment on the 12th day after the footage release. He revised it from moderate and growing to unknown. His superiors asked why he had used the word unknown rather than a more specific rating. He said that unknown was the correct word because the available information was no longer sufficient to generate a specific estimate with any reliability, and that presenting a specific estimate in those circumstances would be a false precision that could produce strategic decisions based on numbers that were essentially invented. He was told to produce a number anyway. He produced the number with a confidence interval so wide that it was functionally a range from plausible to significant. His superiors noted that this was unhelpful. He agreed that it was, and said that the alternative was more unhelpful. because a false confidence in a wrong number was more dangerous than an honest uncertainty in a correct range. This argument was not resolved before the coalition proposal came forward, and the unresolved uncertainty was part of the reason Preela's analysis during the convoy halt landed the way it did. It did not introduce a new concern. It confirmed one that had been sitting in the Oresi analytical file for weeks, waiting for the right data point to make it undeniable. Back on Earth, a defense engineer named Philip Marsh, who had spent 9 years working on one of the classified components of what would eventually become the Terran Defense Cordon, finished his current assignment 2 days after the Proxima footage was released, and filed for reassignment. In the reassignment documentation, in the optional field asking for notes on the applicant's motivation, he wrote that he was glad the thing worked, and asked to be put on whatever came next. His request was approved. He was put on the next project the following Monday morning. Helen Brooke filed a brief internal assessment of the Proxima event's galactic reception. Her assessment noted that the Kreth Dominion's internal communications, which Terran intelligence had been monitoring for the past 3 years with the same quiet consistency it had been applying to every other part of its preparatory work, showed a significant shift in tone in the week following the footage release. The word that appeared with new frequency in those communications, in various linguistic forms specific to the Kreth diplomatic register, was a word that translated most accurately into Terran standard as miscalculated. Senior officials were using it to describe the decision to test the boundary, and were using it with a frequency that suggested the internal post-mortem on the Proxima incident was thorough and uncomfortable. Helen Brooke noted in her assessment that this was encouraging for the medium-term trajectory of the confrontation, and that it would likely not prevent a second test from a different actor. She assessed the probability of a coalition-level response within 4 months at 62%, and recommended that the defense cordon expand its multi-corridor readiness posture accordingly. The recommendation was approved. Liam Garrett received his reassignment orders 1 week after submitting his Helios 4 report. He was being moved to the Outer Corridor Patrol Network, which meant longer deployment periods and a communications delay to Earth that would make regular contact with his daughter Clara more difficult. He packed his gear and reported to his new posting without filing a complaint or requesting a modification to the assignment. He had known when he chose this work that there would be periods when the work took priority over everything else. He had told Clara this. She had said she understood, and she had meant it in the way that 9-year-olds mean things, which is completely and without reservation. He sent her a message before the communications delay got too long. He told her that things were going well. He told her that the stars out here were different from the ones visible from Earth, that the density changed the further you got from the inner system, and that he had been trying to find a way to describe it to her that she could actually picture. He said it was like the difference between looking at a field from close up and looking at the same field from a mountain. Same field, different picture. He said he thought she would probably understand what he meant. He pressed send and went back to work. The coalition that assembled over the following months was, by any measure, a significant political achievement. 7 species in total, including the Oresi Collective as its architects and primary strategic planners, the Kreth Dominion as reluctant participants still managing the internal political fallout from the Proxima incident, the Ulai merchant fleets as primary financial backers whose commercial interests in the affected corridors were both substantial and direct, and 4 smaller civilizations whose involvement ranged from genuine political conviction to simple economic pressure from Ulai trading partners who had made the terms of future contracts quietly conditional on participation. Together they fielded a convoy of 200 vessels. Of those, roughly 140 were commercial transports of various configurations. The remaining 60 were described in their official documentation as escort craft for the protection of commercial assets during transit, a classification with specific and intentional legal significance. The operation was given a formal name. It was called the Terran Access Initiative Convoy, and it was submitted to the Galactic Conclave as a legally protected trade transit under Article 7 of the Galactic Common Commerce Accord, which guaranteed member species the right of passage through established trade corridors, regardless of local border declarations by individual planetary systems. The legal argument was not absurd. Article 7 was real, and had been in active use for over a century. It had resolved several significant corridor disputes between species whose negotiating positions had seemed equally fixed at the outset. The Oresi legal team, led by a senior advocate named Sael Dorn, who had spent his career navigating the specific overlap between galactic common law and individual species sovereignty claims, had spent 3 months constructing the case document. It was solid on paper, genuinely solid, in the way that a legal argument is solid when it has been reviewed by careful people who know the law well and have found no obvious flaw. The flaw was not obvious. It was subtle, and it was in a specific amendment to Article 7 that had been ratified 17 years earlier and had not been the subject of any major legal action since, which meant it existed in the law without having been tested or widely discussed in practical terms. Gregory Cole had found it in his first reading of the article, 18 months before the coalition formed. He had written the counter-argument in full before anyone outside Earth knew a coalition was being discussed. The counter-argument was waiting in a secure file, complete and documented, needing nothing but a date to be current. Cole was a person who believed that preparation was not a response to anticipated events. It was a response to the fact that unanticipated events always occurred, and that being ready for the anticipated ones freed up capacity to handle them. On a cold morning in the outer administrative district of the Oresi homeworld, Kale Orun, senior strategist of the collective's External Affairs Division, finalized the proposal that had been developing in his thinking for 6 weeks. He had been careful, as he always was. The proposal called for a coordinated transit of Terran-declared exclusion zones by a fleet large enough that direct containment would be impossible. Not an invasion. Not a military action in any documentable sense. A peaceful commercial convoy, protected by escort vessels, operating under a formal legal framework, visible and documented, and impossible to characterize as covert. The convoy size had been calculated against the best available intelligence on Terran defensive capability. 200 vessels was a specific number, not a round number chosen for appearance. It was the number the Oresi intelligence assessment had determined would exceed what the Terran defense cordon could simultaneously manage, without dividing its attention to a point where effective containment became operationally impossible. The assessment had been built on the 42 vessels observed at Proxima, scaled against known Terran economic capacity and shipbuilding infrastructure data, and stress-tested against 3 different capability growth scenarios. The assessment was wrong, not slightly wrong, wrong in a foundational way that only became visible from the outside once the convoy was already moving, and could not be quietly stopped without acknowledging what had been discovered. The convoy assembled at a staging point near the Oresi outer system over 6 weeks. Its departure was not hidden. Its route was filed with the Conclave Secretariat under Article 7 provisions. Its member vessels operated under their standard identification beacons. The Oresi strategic team had designed this transparency deliberately. Whatever happened when the convoy encountered a Terran response, it would happen in full public view, and the Terran Council would have to choose between allowing passage and enforcing the declaration in a way the coalition's legal brief was prepared to characterize as a violation of galactic common commerce protections. It was a sophisticated calculation. It failed because it assumed the Terran Council's primary concern was avoiding the characterization of aggression and would therefore seek the least confrontational available response. That assumption had been built on 40 years of observing human diplomatic behavior in conclave settings, where Terran representatives had consistently sought de-escalation and compromise rather than confrontation. What the Oresi strategic team had not accounted for was that the humans in those conclave settings had been operating in an environment where confrontation had no support structure behind it. The humans who had de-escalated for 40 years had done so not because they preferred de-escalation as a philosophy, but because the alternative had not yet been ready. The alternative was now ready, had been ready for some time, and had been tested once already. The convoy entered the Kepler-22 corridor on a Tuesday morning. Convoy Commander Tesev, an experienced Uli fleet officer who had made this transit dozens of times before the declaration without incident, had received detailed briefings on the Proxima event and had been given clear assurances by the Oresi strategic team that the convoy scale made direct containment operationally impossible. She entered the corridor with full confidence in that assessment. What appeared on her sensor grid 40 minutes into the transit made her drop her coffee cylinder and not notice it hit the floor. 109 vessels, not 42. Not a scaled response proportional to the Proxima incident. 109. Deployed in a formation that occupied the corridor's full navigable width in a configuration that had been designed for a convoy of exactly this size and shape. They had not responded to the convoy's entry by scrambling into position. Tesev's technical officer estimated, based on ambient thermal trace analysis, that the Terran fleet had been holding its current position for not less than 10 days. 10 days before the coalition convoy departed its staging point. They had known, not guessed, known, the departure schedule, the convoy configuration, the route, the timeline. They had known all of it in advance and had positioned accordingly. Tesev halted the convoy. She opened a channel to the Oresi command vessel and reported what her sensors were showing. Sael Dorn reviewed the data. He did not order the convoy forward. He asked for 15 minutes. During those 15 minutes, an intelligence analyst named Prela, who had been quietly troubled by gaps in the coalition's capability assessment for weeks and had not yet found the right moment to raise the issue formally, raised it now. The Proxima event had involved 42 vessels. The official Terran defense budget disclosed to the Galactic Conclave would not have supported the construction and sustained operation of 42 vessels of that capability level within the available time frame, based on known Terran shipbuilding rates and raw material costs. The numbers had not added up, and Prela had flagged this in her own notes 3 weeks ago, without bringing it forward, because a single analyst questioning a validated strategic assessment needed more than a budget discrepancy to justify the interruption. 109 vessels justified the interruption. If the capability assessment was wrong, she said, then every strategic assumption built on that assessment was also wrong, including the assumption that 200 convoy vessels exceeded containment capacity. Sael Dorn sat with this for a moment. Then he told Tesev to hold position. Tesev held position for 4 hours and 12 minutes. During those 4 hours, something happened on every vessel in the convoy that most crew members either did not notice or noticed and dismissed. A brief read access event on core navigation files. Duration approximately 4 seconds per vessel. Small enough that many automated monitoring systems logged it as a background process rather than generating an alert. Technical officers who noticed it at all reported it as a possible sensor ghost from the stress of the navigation halt. It was not a ghost. Sael Dorn eventually recommended that the convoy turn back. He did not frame it as retreat in the official record. He described it as a temporary suspension of the transit, pending further legal review, which was technically accurate, in that legal review was indeed going to be required, and the transit had indeed been suspended. The convoy turned around. All 200 vessels carried their navigation cores home completely intact. Nothing had been visibly taken. No chip had been placed on any console this time. 3 weeks later, when Dara Holt, the ULI Consortium's financial overseer aboard the lead transport, formally requested a deep security analysis of the convoy's navigation systems because she had logged the brief anomaly event, and it was her professional discipline to follow every logged anomaly through to resolution, the ULI technical team found a complete copy of the routing history, transit schedules, fleet identification codes, and vessel performance logs for all 200 ships. Silently extracted during the 4-hour halt, undetected, without triggering a single active security alert on any vessel. The ULI Consortium brought this to senior leadership with very careful language. Someone had read everything they had, every route, every schedule, every vessel performance profile. And in the weeks following, as ULI transports began experiencing minor but inexplicable navigation delays in corridors they had used for years, and as transit requests to Terran-adjacent corridors were met with responses that cited those vessels' complete prior transit histories in accurate detail, the meaning became fully clear. The Terran Council knew where every ULI ship went, on what schedule, under what operational parameters, and it had let the ULI Consortium discover this fact in the most uncomfortable way possible, while making no public announcement about it at all. An independent analyst named Colin Ward, hired by the second of 3 technical firms the consortium brought in to investigate, wrote in his confidential report that the pattern was consistent with a calibration shift resulting from an external data input event, and that whoever had produced this effect was operating at a level of technical sophistication he had not previously encountered in commercial fleet systems. He said in his report that the effect appeared targeted rather than incidental. He said he thought this worth noting carefully. Petra Hollis, the consortium's senior strategic planner, read that report twice, and wrote a private message to the Terran Governing Council, using a contact address she had held for 15 years, from a human trade partner she had always found to be unusually direct in commercial negotiations. The message was brief and direct itself. The HFY Consortium was interested in discussing a new commercial framework that properly recognized Terran sovereignty interests. It asked if Secretary General Amara Ose would receive a private representative. The response came in 2 hours. The Secretary General would be willing. At the Galactic Conclave, the vote on the Terran Access Initiative failed with 23 species voting against, 4 abstaining, and the original 7 coalition members casting the only votes in favor. Gregory Cole had submitted the counter-argument that morning. 12 pages. It demonstrated that Article 7 specifically exempted corridors within sovereign exclusion zones registered under galactic common law. It demonstrated that the Oresi legal team had cited an outdated version of the article. And it attached, as an exhibit, the complete record of 47 Terran complaints and the 6 responses received, with documented outcomes, including 31 unresolved disappearances. The conclave floor was quiet for a long time after the counter-argument was read aloud. Sale Dorn was in the observation gallery above the main floor when the vote result was announced. He sat very still. Then he turned to Preela beside him and said that they had underestimated the humans at every single step. Preela said nothing, because she had been thinking the same thing for some time, and had not said it aloud until someone else said it first. The convoy had turned back. The legal challenge had failed. 2 very public confrontations had resolved in humanity's favor, without a weapon being discharged, without a formal accusation of aggression, and without the Terran Governing Council making any public statement beyond a brief confirmation that the Kepler-22 corridor had remained clear. Amara Ose left the council building on the evening after the vote. A photographer captured her on the steps. She looked exactly as she always looked, focused, unhurried, already thinking about what came next. What came next was silence. Kale Orun's preparation of the coalition proposal involved more than 6 weeks of internal work, though he dated its intellectual origin to a meeting he had attended 3 months before he began writing anything down. A meeting in which the Oresi External Affairs Council had reviewed the Proxima footage for the 3rd time, and a senior official had said, with the confidence of long experience, that the event was an anomaly of preparation and not a demonstration of sustained capacity. Kale Orun had not challenged this assessment in the meeting. He had thought about it for 3 months, and at the end of those 3 months, he had concluded that whether or not the assessment was accurate, a coalition large enough to raise the legal and political costs of Terran enforcement above a sustainable level would be effective, regardless of how well prepared the Terran defense cordon actually was. The math of political sustainability, he believed, worked independently of the math of tactical capability. If the Terran Council faced a choice between letting the convoy through or enforcing the declaration against 200 vessels in full public view under a legal framework that framed the convoy as a protected commercial transit, the political cost of enforcement might exceed the political cost of accommodation. That was the bet he was making. It was a coherent bet. It was the wrong bet, but it was coherent, and coherent bets from experienced strategists fail in specific ways that are instructive, and the specific way this one failed was that it had been built on an assumption about what the Terran Council's primary concern was. Kale Orun had assumed their primary concern was the characterization of their actions by other species. He had built his entire strategy around making the enforcement look aggressive and the convoy look protected. He had been wrong about the primary concern. The Terran Council's primary concern was the boundary, not the characterization of its enforcement. They had spent 11 years documenting every violation, not to build a case that would look good in an argument, but to build a foundation for a position that would hold, regardless of how it was characterized. You could not characterize your way out of a line that someone had drawn with that much preparation behind it. Tessev, standing on the command deck of the lead HFY transport with 109 Terran vessels on her sensor grid and the convoy halted behind her, had a specific thought during the 4-hour pause that she would later describe in the debrief she gave the consortium. She said she had looked at the formation geometry of the Terran fleet and had realized something that had not been in any of the strategic briefing materials. The formation was not designed to stop 200 vessels through force. It was designed to make the decision to continue feel like a decision the convoy commander was making with full information and full responsibility for the consequences. The Terran fleet was not threatening. It was simply present and perfectly positioned, and waiting with a patience that suggested it had planned to wait as long as necessary, and had budgeted for that accordingly. It was, she said, the most effective thing she had ever seen done, without a word or a shot. It was the tactical equivalent of someone opening a door and standing aside and letting you make the choice yourself, while making absolutely certain you understood what was on the other side of the threshold. She had not gone through the door. She would not have gone through it, even without the intervention of Sale Dorn's advisory team, because she had looked at what was on the other side, and had done the same calculation any experienced commander does, when the available information is clearly incomplete, and the stakes are not recoverable from a wrong decision. She had stopped. The stop lasted 4 hours and 12 minutes, during which the Terran fleet did nothing visible at all. What the Terran fleet was doing that was not visible occupied exactly 4 seconds per vessel, and left no trace that any sensor on any of the 200 convoy ships was sensitive enough to detect in real time. The complete navigation intelligence of the largest commercial fleet the Uli Consortium had ever assembled was extracted, catalogued, and confirmed during the pause, with the same quiet efficiency that had characterized every piece of Terran operational work throughout the confrontation. The people who did this work were not celebrated afterward. They were reassigned to the next project, as they always were. Philip Marsh, who had asked to be put on whatever came next, was one of them. He filed his completion report with the same brevity he gave every completion report, and noted only that all parameters had been met. Dara Holt's anomaly report, the document that eventually led to the discovery of the navigation intelligence extraction, was filed at 1847 hours on the day the convoy returned to the staging point. She had been awake for 31 hours at that point, and was running on the specific kind of focus that professionals in her field developed over years of high-stakes commercial work, where the cost of missed details was always counted in real currency. She almost did not file the report that day. She almost told herself it could wait until she had slept. Then she thought about the kind of person she had been throughout her career, the kind who filed the report before sleeping and not after, and she filed the report. 3 weeks later, she received the technical findings from the security analysis her report had initiated, and she sat in her office for a long time reading them. Then she drafted the message to the Terran Governing Council. The conclave vote on the Terran Access Initiative was a formal event attended by senior representatives of all 41 member species. The chamber was full in the way that major votes always filled it, with observers and aides and documentation staff occupying every available position around the edges of the main floor. Gregory Cole was not in the chamber. He was in a secure working space 3 floors below, available by communication if needed, reviewing a document unrelated to the current vote, because the current vote had been resolved 3 months ago, when he wrote the counter-argument, and he did not expect it to require his presence in the room. He was correct. It did not require his presence. The counter-argument was read aloud by a conclave legal officer, in a voice that was professionally neutral, and therefore unintentionally more damning for the coalition's position than a voice carrying any editorial tone could have been. The legal officer read it as a recitation of accurate facts arranged in a logical sequence, which it was, and the combination of accuracy and logic in that particular sequence was sufficient. The vote was called. The coalition lost by a margin that was not close. Cale Arun left the building afterward without speaking to anyone. He had a report to write. The silence began on a Friday, and it began without announcement. There was no press release from the Terran Governing Council explaining what was happening, or why. There was no formal declaration that humanity was withdrawing from galactic affairs. There was only the fact of it, revealing itself over the following days and weeks like water draining from a basin, gradual and then undeniable. Terran embassies across 14 star systems stopped answering communications. Not with an error message, not with a temporary closure notice. They simply stopped answering, as if someone had walked out mid-shift and not returned. Terran trade representatives completed their assignments and returned home on schedule, quietly and without drama, and their replacements did not arrive. The Terran operated relay stations that provided maintenance services for a section of the galactic communication grid suspended operations with 30-day notice periods, precisely in compliance with their contracts. Citing an operational review, no human vessel appeared anywhere outside declared Terran space. The council had spent 3 years before the silence began, conducting an audit of every point at which Terran participation, Terran technology, or Terran services formed a load-bearing piece of the galactic economic and infrastructure system. They had done this without announcing it, which was not difficult, because no one in the galactic conclave had thought to ask what Terran external engagement actually looked like when measured from the outside in, rather than from the inside out. The general assumption among the older species was that Terran involvement in the galactic economy was a net consumption, humans receiving more value from participation in galactic trade than they contributed to it. The audit told a different story, and it told it in numbers that were both precise and irrefutable. Humanity had been in deep space for only 3 centuries, but those centuries had been spent building with the intensity of a species that had learned over thousands of years on a single planet how to make things work when resources were constrained, and failure had consequences that could not be negotiated away. Terran engineering had developed a reputation, in small circles that the Grand Conclave had never prioritized, for being unusually reliable under sustained operational stress. Terran rare mineral processing had produced techniques over 40 years that were measurably more efficient than those used by species with 4 times the interstellar history, because Terran engineers had approached the problem as an optimization challenge rather than as a continuation of existing methods. And Terran jump gate maintenance contracts, awarded quietly and consistently to Terran firms over many years because they underbid competitors and delivered results on schedule, had spread across 17 gate installations in 6 different systems. Every one of those installations received a formal contract suspension notice on the same day. The notices were legally correct in every detail, giving 30-day notice periods in exact compliance with the signed contract terms. 3 installations reported degraded performance in secondary calibration systems within the first 10 days. Not catastrophic failures, not emergencies. The kind of issues that could be addressed by other qualified technicians with the right diagnostic equipment. The right diagnostic equipment was proprietary to the Terran firms holding the contracts, and those firms were not taking external service calls during the review period. A senior maintenance engineer named Leonard Hatch, who had spent 12 years working on ULI-operated transit infrastructure and had occasionally collaborated with Terran maintenance teams on shared corridor installations, read the suspension notices and said quietly to a colleague that people had been treating Terran technical staff as interchangeable labor for too long and were now finding out what the word interchangeable actually required in practice. His colleague asked what he meant. He said that interchangeable meant you had a replacement ready, and nobody had thought to have one ready. The ULI consortium's problems arrived faster and hit harder. The navigation intelligence extracted during the convoy halt had not been deployed as a weapon. It had been used as a demonstration, delivered in stages, in a way that made clear the Terran Council had information it had chosen not to use aggressively, but could choose differently at any time. ULI commercial routes that had been generating consistent profit for years were experiencing transit delays. Not because of physical obstruction. The corridors were physically clear, but the routing anomalies affecting those transits were specific to corridors that crossed Terran-adjacent zones, and the pattern was consistent enough and specific enough that dismissing it as coincidence required a level of motivated reasoning that Petra Hollis was not professionally capable of applying. She had engaged 3 independent technical firms, as previously noted, and she had received her answer. She had sent her private message to the Terran Council and received a response. The response had not made any promises. It had simply confirmed willingness to meet. In the world of experienced commercial negotiators, a confirmed willingness to meet from the party holding the leverage was itself a significant piece of information. It meant they were not interested in permanent exclusion. They were interested in new terms. Petra Hollis began drafting a framework proposal the afternoon she received the response. She worked carefully, with the knowledge that the people reviewing her proposal had spent 11 years preparing for this negotiation and would notice anything that attempted to reframe the situation in terms more favorable to the ULI consortium than the actual balance of advantage justified. She drafted in terms that recognized Terran sovereignty claims clearly and directly. She told her assistant, who had worked with her for 8 years and had never seen her accept terms that disadvantaged the consortium, that this was not a capitulation. It was a recalibration of what was actually true about the relationship, and recalibrations done honestly were always better than the alternative. The Kreth Dominion was working through its own recalibration, though the Kreth High Council used different language for it internally. A significant portion of Kreth industrial output relied on rare mineral inputs passing through processing facilities in which Terran firms held minority but technically critical stakes. The withdrawal of Terran operational participation had created a production bottleneck that was growing measurably more expensive to route around each month. Alternative solutions had been identified, budgeted, and initiated. They were taking longer and costing more than projected, and the gap between projection and reality was not narrowing. It was widening, slowly but consistently, in a direction that the High Council's economic analysts were finding increasingly difficult to frame optimistically. Vreth Kaldon, retired from active command and serving as senior advisor to the High Council, listened to the debate between factions for 3 sessions before he spoke. When he spoke, he said only this: the humans had not done anything that could be characterized as aggression in this entire period. They had set a boundary, enforced it twice when challenged, and then gone home. Every difficulty the Dominion was now experiencing was the consequence of dependencies that had developed over decades, without anyone in the High Council recognizing their strategic significance. That was not a human failure. That was a Kreth failure, and it needed to be understood as such before any productive engagement with the humans could be attempted. He was not popular in the room when he said it. He was taken seriously because he was the only senior official who had been present at Proxima and had come back from it with a clear head and a willingness to describe what had actually happened, rather than the version that was more comfortable to report. On Earth, Owen Fletcher's widely read article argued that the silent period was effective in theory, but carried real costs for real people, and that the Council owed the public a clearer accounting of progress. Amara Osei read it the morning it was published, told Helen Brooke that Fletcher was not wrong, and that the internal timeline already accounted for precisely that concern, and returned to her briefing materials. 3 of the 7 coalition species made private contact with the Terran Governing Council during the silence. 2 led to quiet preliminary agreements. The third, from a small species that had joined the coalition primarily under Uli financial pressure, sent a direct request to resume trade relations, and was given a clear path forward that required formal recognition of the Terran exclusion zones. They registered that recognition quietly. They were the first. They would not be the last. An independent galactic trade research body published a quarterly economic analysis, estimating that the direct economic impact of reduced Terran commercial engagement had produced losses totaling approximately 11.4% of annual trade value across the inner spiral corridors. The report noted that this figure substantially exceeded any pre-conflict projection by coalition economic advisors and reflected a level of Terran economic integration that had been systematically underestimated. Every major government and commercial entity that had been part of the coalition read that report in full. It changed the conversation in the way that numbers change conversations, not by winning an argument, but by making the cost of continuing the argument visible and specific and impossible to attribute to anything, except the choice to continue. The domestic support fund the Terran Governing Council had established before the silence began was not a secret. It had been discussed in public council sessions 4 months before implementation, and had been challenged by 3 opposition legislators, who argued that it was premature to establish a fund for a situation that had not yet occurred, and might not occur. Amara Osei had responded to the challenge by saying that the fund was premature in exactly the same way that maintaining a fire extinguisher was premature in a building that had not yet caught fire. The opposition legislators had noted their objections for the record, and the fund had been established. By the 5th month of the silence, the fund was in active use across 9 of the 14 outer colony zones, and had prevented 2 significant economic disruptions from becoming 3. The people receiving support from the fund were not all supporters of the Council's approach. Several of them had voted against the administration in the last election, and had publicly criticized the border declaration as unnecessarily provocative before it was implemented. They received support from the fund anyway, without paperwork that referenced their voting history or their public statements, because the fund had been established for the people of the outer zones, and the people of the outer zones were all of them. Owen Fletcher wrote a piece about this specific aspect of the fund's administration, pointing out that it was both an example of effective governance and an implicit argument that the Council had planned the entire confrontation more thoroughly than its critics had credited. He wrote it carefully, because he was a careful journalist, and he acknowledged in the piece that he was not certain whether the thoroughness was genuinely admirable or slightly unsettling. He decided, on reflection, that it was both, and published it that way. The most significant thing that happened during the silence period in terms of long-term galactic political architecture was not visible as a news event. It was a series of bilateral conversations, initiated by species that had no direct stake in the confrontation, with the Terran Council. These species had watched the Proxima incident and the convoy halt, and the conclave vote, and the subsequent silence, and they had drawn a conclusion that was not about human capability specifically. It was about what the entire sequence demonstrated about how power was actually organized in the galactic system versus how the official conclave structure described it. The official structure described 41 species as equal members of a governing body that managed shared interests through consensus and legal frameworks. The sequence of events surrounding the Terran Declaration had demonstrated that within that official structure, some species had for decades been treating others as non-members in practical terms, ignoring their complaints and overriding their registrations and passing through their declared zones without notification. The conclave had allowed this. The legal frameworks had not prevented it. And when one of the affected species had decided to address the discrepancy through force of its own, rather than through the official channels had been unable to stop it and had eventually been obliged to ratify its position. Several of the neutral species, watching this, drew a conclusion that was rational if uncomfortable. The official channels were not the actual channels. The actual channels were the ones backed by capacity. And any species that wanted its interests reliably represented in galactic affairs needed to understand which channel it was actually operating in and what it would take to be taken seriously in the one that mattered. A small but technically sophisticated species called the Vel-Shirak, which had never before approached the Terran Council on any matter, and which had been a peripheral presence in conclave affairs for most of its galactic membership, sent a formal request during the 10th month of the silence, asking whether the Terran Council would be willing to discuss a mutual security consultation framework. The request was careful and specific about what it was not asking for. It was not asking for a military alliance. It was not asking for economic integration. It was asking only whether the Terran Council would be willing to communicate regularly, and specifically on matters affecting the Vel-Shirak's registered zones, and whether the Council would consider extending the boundary protections it had demonstrated at Proxima to a formal consultation agreement. Amara Osei read this request twice. She asked Helen Brooke what she knew about the Vel-Shirak. Helen Brooke said that they had been a conclave member for 60 years, had filed 12 formal complaints through official channels over that period, had received substantive responses to 2 of them, and were technically advanced in deep space navigation systems in ways that Terran analysts had noted as interesting, but had not previously had reason to engage with formally. Amara Osei said that the Council would be willing to meet. The Vel-Shirak meeting happened quietly, in a secondary diplomatic facility in New Zealand, with no press presence and no formal documentation beyond the internal Council record. It lasted 3 days. At the end of it, a preliminary framework was initialed by both parties. The framework was not a treaty. It would not become a treaty for another 2 years, but it established the basis of an engagement that would, over the following decade, prove to be one of the more consequential bilateral relationships the Terran Council developed in the post-silence period. A week after the Vel-Shirak meeting concluded, a second species made contact, then a third, then a fourth, who said explicitly in their initial communication that they were aware that other species had already made contact and that they did not wish to be late to a conversation that appeared to be developing. Amara Osei found this last message mildly entertaining and did not tell the species in question that she found it so. The economic analysis published in the 14th month of the silence was prepared by a research body called the Independent Galactic Trade Institute, which had no formal affiliation with any conclave member species, and funded its operations through subscription fees from commercial entities across 17 systems. Its director, a methodical economist named Sura Vel, whose specialty was corridor traffic modeling, had been watching the Terran silence with professional attention since the 2nd month, and had begun accumulating data for a comprehensive impact analysis when it became clear that the silence would last longer than most initial projections had suggested. The 11.4% figure in her report was not a round number. It was the result of 6 weeks of calculation, using 11 different modeling approaches, and the variance between approaches was small enough that she reported it without a confidence interval, because the confidence was high. She said in her introductory notes that she had expected, when she began the analysis, to find that the impact of the Terran withdrawal was significant but bounded, consistent with the withdrawal of a junior member species whose external engagement was substantial but not structurally central to the galactic economy. She said she had not found that. What she had found was that Terran commercial and technical engagement had, over the preceding 4 decades, quietly become load-bearing in ways that were not visible from the outside because they were distributed across many sectors and many arrangements, rather than concentrated in any single visible dependency. She said the finding was, in her professional judgment, the most significant economic intelligence failure she had seen in her career, and she was including that assessment in the report because she believed the conclave's economic planning processes needed to understand that the gap between what they thought they knew about Terran integration and what was actually true had been large and consequential. Her report circulated through galactic economic and political leadership over the following 3 weeks. It changed conversations in the way that numbers change conversations, not by convincing people who were unconvinced, but by making it impossible for the already half-convinced to maintain their resistance in good conscience. The coalition species that had been engaged in quiet preliminary conversations with the Terran Council accelerated those conversations. The 2 coalition species that had not yet made contact did so within 30 days of the report's circulation. The Conclave Secretariat began drafting the summit invitation the day after receiving requests from 3 major delegations, asking whether such an invitation had been prepared. The summit invitation arrived from the Galactic Conclave's Administrative Secretariat on the first day of the 18th month of the silence. It was addressed to the Terran Governing Council, signed by the Conclave's presiding chair, and the language had clearly passed through many careful revisions before it reached its final form. It asked, with measured and formal phrasing, whether the Terran Governing Council would be willing to meet with representatives of the full conclave membership to discuss the restoration of normal diplomatic and commercial relations. It did not include the word apology. It contained no admission of legal or moral wrongdoing by any party. It was written with the precision of people who understood exactly what they were doing and had chosen every word with full awareness of what it did and did not concede. In the diplomatic vocabulary of the Galactic Conclave, a request of this kind, from the assembled membership to a single species, was extraordinary. It had not happened in recorded history. The presiding chair, a veteran of 40 years in conclave administration named Aurel Vash, who had held the position through 17 major interspecies disputes and had never once sent a communication of this category, reviewed the final draft 4 times before authorizing it. Amara Osei's response was sent within the week. It agreed to the summit. It specified Geneva, Earth, under Terran diplomatic protocol. It specified that the Terran delegation would set the agenda. It specified that security arrangements would be managed exclusively by Terran personnel for the duration of the summit. The Conclave Secretariat came back with a counter-proposal suggesting a neutral location. The Terran Council responded that Geneva was the appropriate location and the only location the Council would accept. The Conclave Secretariat accepted within 4 days. No further counter-proposals were submitted on the question of location. 41 species sent delegations to Geneva. The delegations arrived and were received according to Terran protocol. Every arriving delegation was greeted by a Terran junior diplomat, processed through Terran security screening, and directed to their assigned accommodations. The summit chamber had been arranged in a format that reflected the host delegation's preference rather than the circular configuration traditional to conclave sessions. The Terran representatives were seated at the head of the room. No delegation objected to any element of this. Not one formal objection was filed in the pre-summit administrative record, which was something that the Conclave Secretariat staff noted privately among themselves, because in their collective experience spanning decades of interstellar summit management, the absence of any seating dispute was itself anomalous. A young Terran diplomatic aide named Sophie Grant, on her first major international assignment, and trying very hard to maintain the composure she observed in the senior people around her, noted the same thing in her private journal on the first evening. She wrote that she had been briefed to expect at least 2 rounds of negotiation over procedural matters before the substantive agenda could begin, because procedural disputes were how delegations established status before the real work started. She wrote that the absence of those disputes was saying something very clearly, and that she was still working out exactly what. A senior member of the Terran delegation, a man named Arthur Danes who had been in government service for 31 years, and had attended 11 previous interspecies summits in various capacities, read Sophie Grant's evening journal entry later, when she shared it with the team as part of the standard documentation process. He said in the debrief that she had identified the most important thing that happened on the first day, which was that nothing happened procedurally. He said that in his experience, when delegations with significant leverage over a situation stop fighting about where to sit, they have already made a decision about the outcome and are conserving energy for the implementation. Amara Osei opened the summit with a statement that lasted 7 minutes. It was not a victory speech, and it contained no language that could be characterized as triumphant. It described, with the same directness she had applied to every communication over the preceding years, what the Terran Governing Council considered necessary for the restoration of full diplomatic and commercial relations. It covered 4 points. First, formal conclave recognition of the right of any member species to declare and enforce sovereign exclusion zones under galactic common law, without requiring conclave majority approval for the declaration to take legal effect. Second, establishment of a mandatory consultation process for commercial transit through corridors adjacent to any declared exclusion zone, requiring advance notification and agreement from the sovereign species before any transit was scheduled. Third, formation of a conclave-level investigative body with independent authority to investigate reported violations of exclusion zone boundaries, with findings that carried binding legal weight, enforceable against any member species including the largest. Fourth, formal documentation of the 47 Terran complaints submitted to the conclave over the preceding decade, to be entered into the permanent conclave record as evidence of systemic failure in the existing complaint and response process, with a binding commitment to structural reform and a scheduled review cycle. The 7th minute contained the statement's final sentence. Amara Osei said that the Terran Governing Council had not sought this confrontation, had not escalated it, and had not conducted it in a manner that any species present could characterize as aggression under any applicable legal framework. She said the Council intended to return to full participation in galactic affairs, immediately upon agreement to the 4 points. She said there was nothing else to discuss. She stopped speaking. She waited. The first day produced caucuses and private conversations and delegations moving between rooms in patterns that Helen Brooke, watching from near the back of the main chamber, read as the political work of deciding how to frame a decision already made, rather than the operational work of actually making a decision. She had seen both before, and they looked and moved differently. This was framing work, and it was happening relatively quickly. On the morning of the second day, the Kreth Dominion's senior delegate, a career diplomat named Aldrich Voss, who had spent the past 2 years rebuilding the Dominion's diplomatic posture after the Proxima incident, requested a private meeting with Amara Osei. The meeting lasted 40 minutes. No official transcript was released. Based on accounts from people briefed on its contents afterward, Aldrich Voss said the Kreth Dominion was prepared to accept all 4 points, and wished to be recorded as accepting them without reservation. He said the Dominion was prepared to make restitution for the unauthorized incursions documented in the Terran complaint record, in an amount to be negotiated in a separate process. He asked one thing in return, which was that the specifics of the navigation intelligence acquisition during the convoy halt be formally classified and not entered into the public conclave record. Amara Osei said she would take that request under advisement. The navigation intelligence question was resolved in a classified annex to the summit agreement, the contents of which were never publicly disclosed. What was publicly recorded was that the Kreth Dominion was the first major delegation to sign the summit agreement, doing so before the formal plenary session had concluded, and that the signature was witnessed by the conclave's presiding chair and 2 independent observers from species not party to the original dispute. The Uli Consortium's formal delegation signed within 2 hours of the Kreth, following the guidance Petra Hollis had been sending throughout the summit from her preliminary conversations with the Terran Council. The Oresi Collective took a full day and a half longer than any other major delegation, and their signature came with a carefully worded formal statement that avoided any language readable as an admission of wrong intent during the convoy operation. The Terran Council reviewed the statement and confirmed it was acceptable. The statement said what it said. The record would say what the record said. Both things could exist in the same archive simultaneously. That had always been true of records. Gregory Cole, reviewing documents from the third row of the Terran delegation's section throughout the proceedings, permitted himself a small expression of satisfaction when the Oresi signature was confirmed. He controlled it quickly. It was not the kind of expression that photographed interestingly, and it did not. When the last of the 41 delegations had signed, the summit was declared concluded. Amara Osei made a closing statement shorter than her opening one. She thanked the assembled delegations, confirmed that Terran embassies would reopen on a rolling schedule beginning the following week, and expressed that the Council looked forward to resuming productive engagement with all member species. She made no reference to the past 18 months. No reference to convoy incidents or buffer zone encounters or legal challenges or navigation anomalies or any of the specific events that had brought 41 species to Geneva to sign a document on Terran terms in a room arranged by human hands. She looked entirely forward. The choice was deliberate, and every senior diplomat in the room understood it as such. Looking back served the party that had lost more than the party that had won. Looking forward was its own kind of authority. Aldrich Voss passed a window in the main corridor on his way to the transport bay. He stopped briefly and looked out over Geneva. He had not been to Earth before. The city carried thousands of years of visible history in a way that the administrative centers of other species did not. Different eras of human building coexisting in the same view without any attempt to make them uniform. He looked at it for a moment, then walked on. A member of his delegation walking behind him noted the pause in his own record of the day. He wrote that the Kreth senior delegate had stood at the window with the expression of someone who had been wrong about something important for a long time and was standing still for a moment to absorb the correct version of it. Kale Arun boarded the Oresi delegation's transport as Geneva evening arrived. He was working on his post-event analysis document, as he had been since early afternoon. He had been a careful person for 30 years, and he was still a careful person now. The analysis acknowledged the intelligence failures without softening them. It acknowledged the legal miscalculation. It acknowledged the economic dependency analysis that had been built on incomplete data, and in its final paragraph, in direct and unambiguous language, it said something very few Oresi officials had ever committed to writing about any other species. It said the Terran Governing Council had demonstrated, across the full arc of this confrontation, a level of strategic patience, technical capacity, and legal preparation that the Oresi intelligence framework had not assigned to human civilization. It said this represented a significant failure of assessment methodology, not of data collection alone. And it said that the failure had roots in a systematic tendency to measure species capability against visible historical performance, rather than developmental trajectory. Human civilization's trajectory, the document concluded, had been consistently underestimated at every point of contact throughout recorded Terran-galactic relations, and this pattern needed to be understood and corrected before it produced further costly miscalculation. He filed it into the classified archive. He did not expect it to change things immediately. Documents rarely did. But it would be there when people needed it, and people always eventually needed the honest version. Back in Geneva, Amara Osei was already reading the next day's briefing materials. New trade agreement requests from 3 Outer Rim species, a proposed joint scientific mission with a neutral species, a routine patrol report from Commander Liam Garrett, still serving in the outer corridors, covering the Helios 4 region. The region was quiet. Mining operations were running normally. No unauthorized contacts. His crew was healthy. Everything within expected parameters. Amara Osei made a note. She wrote the word good. She closed the briefing file and prepared for the next morning. The borders were still where they had always been. They would remain there. The galaxy knew that now, fully, and with the specific knowledge that comes not from being told something, but from having tested it and received the answer directly. 41 signatures sat in the summit record. They were not a concession reluctantly given by civilizations that had never encountered real resistance. They were something more permanent than that. They were a receipt, delivered to the species that had promised one. 3 weeks after humanity said, "Do not enter," and the galaxy had laughed and decided to walk through the door anyway. The door had not opened. It never would. And every species in the known galaxy now held a copy of the documentation proving it. Sophie Grant wrote her final journal entry on the transport home. She had been a diplomatic aide for 14 months. She had not expected her first major assignment to look like this. She wrote that she had spent 2 days watching 41 delegations from civilizations older than human agriculture come to terms, in different ways and at different speeds, and with different degrees of grace, with something that should not have required a confrontation to establish. She wrote that the most striking thing, in the end, was not the signatures and not the language of the agreement, and not the procedural details she had spent weeks preparing for. It was the silence in the room after the last signature was given. She wrote that it was the kind of silence that had real weight to it, the kind that only arrives when something that has been contested for a long time is finally settled, and everyone in the room knows it, and no one has anything left to argue. She said she thought she would remember that specific silence for a very long time. She was right about that. Arthur Daines had attended the summit preparation briefings with a specific kind of attention that came from having been in rooms like this many times before and knowing which details mattered and which were noise. He had identified, before the summit began, the 3 delegations whose behavior on the first day would most reliably signal how the overall event would resolve. These were not the 3 most powerful delegations. They were the 3 that historically served as leading indicators of where consensus was forming, because their deliberative processes were faster than the larger species, and their decisions tended to precede the formal movement of the larger parties by a predictable margin. All 3 of those delegations moved toward agreement in the first 4 hours of the summit. Daines reported this to Amara Osei on the evening of the first day. She said that was useful to know, thanked him, and asked whether there was anything she should be doing differently. He said no. He said the process was running correctly, and that her opening statement had done exactly what it needed to do, which was establish the non-negotiable nature of the 4 points, without foreclosing the opportunity for each delegation to find its own path to agreeing with them. She nodded. He went back to his documentation work. He had been doing this work for a long time, and the summit would eventually conclude in a way that would be cited in historical records for decades afterward. But for Daines, the experience was not primarily a historic moment. It was a professional one. A situation had been prepared for, managed with discipline, and resolved in accordance with the preparation. That was the job. He had done the job well before, and he was doing it well now. He did not need it to feel like more than that, to know what it was worth. Prela was not at the summit. She was in the Oresi Analytical Division's main facility, working on a second document that followed from the first. Where the first document had addressed the specific failures of the coalition strategy, the second was broader. It examined the analytical methodology that had produced those failures and tried to identify where, at the structural level, the Oresi intelligence framework had consistently underperformed in assessing species that did not operate through the specific visible channels that Oresi methodology had been built to evaluate. The core finding was uncomfortable to write. The Oresi had built their intelligence framework around species that organized their capabilities through public institutions and official registrations and formal declarations. They were very good at analyzing those species. They were systematically worse at analyzing species that organized their capabilities through the accumulation of distributed, quiet, non-publicized capacity over long periods. They had read 40 years of Terran external engagement and had produced accurate assessments of everything that had been deliberately made visible. They had missed, repeatedly and consistently, everything that had been kept quiet, not through secrecy, but through the simple fact of never having been asked about. Prela wrote this finding clearly and without softening it. She submitted it to her divisional director with a note saying that she understood it reflected poorly on work she had contributed to over the past 4 years, and that she nonetheless believed it was accurate and important. Her director, a careful official named Alev Sorn who had been in the intelligence service for 26 years, read it twice and approved it for restricted distribution, with a note of his own attached. His note said that Prila had done the hardest part of analytical work, which was not the analysis itself, but the willingness to subject prior conclusions to the same scrutiny applied to new evidence. He said this should be recognized and that her clearance rating should be reviewed upward at the next cycle. It was. Helen Brooke watched the last delegation board their transports from a small observation window in the summit facility's upper level. She had not slept for 32 hours. She was not, by nature or training, a person who showed exhaustion until she was somewhere private enough to let it show, which meant that she was standing at the window looking entirely composed, while running on what she had once described to a colleague as the specific kind of energy that comes from something being finished, that needed finishing. She had worked toward this outcome for 7 years, 3 as a department head and 4 as defense liaison to the Secretary General. She had reviewed sensor data from the Proxima encounter with the same flat professional expression she brought to every briefing. She had read the Navigation Intelligence Extraction Report with the same flat expression. She had watched the conclave vote with that expression, and the failure of the coalition legal challenge with it, and the 18th month of the silence with it. She was very good at that expression. She had practiced it because she believed that the work required it, that people watching you for cues about how to feel about a situation should see steadiness, and should take steadiness from what they saw. Standing at the observation window now, with the last transport cleared and the facility quiet around her, she let the expression go for a moment. Just a moment. Then she straightened up, picked up her briefing materials, and went to find Amara Ose. Amara Ose was already in the car back to the main council building. She had the next day's briefing materials on her tablet, and was reading the first item, which was the trade agreement requests from the Outer Rim species. The car moved through Geneva in the early evening, through streets that had been here for 1,000 years and would be here for 1,000 more regardless of what happened in galactic politics, which was something Amara Ose had always found quietly reassuring. She read the first item and made a note, and moved to the second item, which was the Joint Scientific Mission Proposal, and made a note there too. She did not make a note on the third item, the one from Liam Garrett about the Helios 4 region. She just read it, read his quiet report of a routine patrol with no incidents and nothing unusual, and wrote the word good, and closed the file. Outside the car window, Geneva moved past in the early dark, lit up and unhurried, carrying its thousands of years of human persistence, in the particular way that places do which have seen many things come and go, and have continued existing regardless. She looked at it for a moment, and then looked back at her briefing file. There was a great deal of work still to do. Sophie Grant's journal entry was the last thing filed in the summit's informal documentation archive. It was not required documentation, and its inclusion in the archive was Daines's idea, based on his observation that junior staff perspectives on major events tended to capture details that senior staff, accustomed to those events, overlooked. He had recommended that junior staff on major assignments be encouraged to submit journal extracts, with personal identifying information stripped, to a supplementary record that future analysts could consult for ground-level perspective on events that official records tended to describe from the top down. Sophie Grant's entry was included because Daines had read it and thought it was accurate. It was accurate. She had noticed the right things, and she had noticed them in the right order, and the silence she described at the end, the silence in the room when the last signature was given, was real. It had weight. Several people in that room who had been in diplomatic work for decades had noticed it too, though they had not written it down in those terms. They had noted it internally and moved on to the next item. Sophie Grant wrote it down. The borders remained where they had always been,